Welcome to this new section of the Premiere Pro course, all about definitions and terminology, things you should understand as a video editor. All of the following lessons are going to be short, concise, to the point explanations of important aspects of video editing, things that if someone is working on a project with you and they might ask you about whatever it may be related to editing video, you should understand. So feel free to watch all of them or pick and choose which ones you don't understand and watch those ones. All of them, as I say, are very short and to the point though, and hopefully it helps you become a more well-rounded editor. What does 4K, 8K, HD mean? These are your video resolutions. Standard HD or high definition is going to be 1920 by 1080. 1920 pixels wide by 1080 pixels tall. That's a digital measurement. And the bigger the number means the bigger your resolution is going to be. And so 4K is going to be double what your typical 1920 by 1080 HD is. It's going to be 3840 pixels wide by 2160 pixels tall. And then 8K is going to be double that. There is also a Cinema 4K, which is a bit wider. It's 4096 pixels wide. And so that's going to be a little bit different, but you might have a camera that shoots a Cinema 4K versus the standard 3840 by 2160 4K, which matches the aspect ratio or the size of screen of most television monitors and TV sets. And so now you know what video resolution means. What does alpha mean, or alpha channel, or alpha layer mean? The easiest way to understand alpha is to understand what's transparent in your video and what's not transparent. So if you add a title card, if you have a little graphic or an image that doesn't take up your entire screen, the background of that video is going to be transparent, or could be transparent, if you export it with the alpha channel. If you're editing green screen footage and you are just removing the background so that all you have is a person in front of the green screen left without anything in the background with a transparent background, that's going to be your alpha layer. So if someone asks you to export with an alpha channel or alpha layer, it means exporting your video so that it actually has a transparent background and not a plain black background. And this allows you to take that footage and add it to other projects, for example, a title card, or maybe it's green screen footage that you're taking to another application and editing or adding there. So hopefully you understand what alpha means now. What is aspect ratio? It's the width to height ratio that is represented by numbers such as 16 by 9. That's a common aspect ratio of a lot of televisions or computer monitors. 16 by 9 tall. A 1:1 aspect ratio would be a square. A 16 to 9 ratio is sort of more like your standard widescreen. A 9 to 16 aspect ratio would be tall. 9 wide, 16 high. This is different than video resolution, but it is related. If you think about the standard HD video resolution, 1920 by 1080, if you do the math, 1920 by 1080 is a 16 to 9 ratio. So aspect ratio is literally just the ratio between the width and the height of your frame. What is B-roll? To understand B-roll, you need to know what A-roll is, and I'm talking about the letter A and the letter B roll. So B-roll is going to be your supplemental media, video, photos, things that help describe to the viewer what is being said in your video. A-roll is typically going to be your talking head video. It could be an interview in a documentary. Even if it's a narrative film, you might have your main shot be your A camera or your A roll. And this is going to be a shot of the scene with your actors talking. And then the B roll would be the cutaways, the close-ups, the insert shots, the additional footage that helps make your videos more interesting to watch. For example, in a documentary, you might have someone talking about World War II on screen. This is going to be your A-roll interview. And then your B-roll is going to be historical video clips or photos or even title cards and graphics that you put on top of that video to make it more visually interesting and to tell the story better. So A-roll and B-roll, hopefully you understand that now. What is Bezier or a Bezier curve? This has to do with the acceleration or the speed of an animation or a change in a property. So if we have an object in our frame and it's moving from one side of the frame to the other, a linear, L-I-N-E-A-R, speed would just be moving at the same rate across from one point to the other. A Bezier curve gives us more flexibility in adjusting how fast it accelerates and how fast it decelerates to the final point. So what we can do is ramp up that speed so it slows into the motion and then it goes faster and then it slows down as it reaches its final point. It could be the same with opacity. You could ramp up or down the opacity with a Bezier curve. You could also do this with audio. Instead of just increasing or decreasing the volume of your audio in a linear way, just from 0 to 10 decibels louder or softer, you can ramp it up and down. And why do we do this? Because it's a little bit more natural. Think about a car starting. A car doesn't just hit its full speed and then stop automatically from that full speed. It has to ramp up and down. Same with you walking. So having a Bezier curve that ramps up and ramps down the acceleration or deceleration of our animations makes it more natural. What is chroma keying? Chroma keying is removing a color from your video. So this is related to green screen. It's used interchangeably. Chroma, meaning color, having to do with specific color. Keying, removing that color. It's as simple as that. Color correction versus color grading. Color correction means fixing your shot footage to make it match reality. So things like white balance, you want colors to be the right colors, and having a proper white balance does that. By setting white to be white, it means all of the other colors are going to fall in the proper range. It could also mean fixing exposure, so making your footage brighter, darker. If you shoot in a flat profile, adding some contrast to make it look more natural. Color grading is really about giving a style to your footage. Maybe you want your video to be a little bit warmer. Maybe you want it to be a little desaturated and moodier. Maybe you want it to be black and white, like film noir or a flat black look. Maybe you want to go crazy and do a matrix green hue style look. That's more color grading. So first you correct your footage, and then if you want, you can add style with color grading. What is video codec versus container? And this is related to video format. Basically, a codec is the way your computer compresses your video. So a QuickTime H.264 video is going to be highly compressed, a smaller file size, but still decent quality compared to an Apple ProRes codec, which is going to be a lot larger and even higher quality file size. Different cameras record in different codecs, and when you are exporting your video, you might export in a different codec depending on what the final viewing platform is going to be, whether it's online versus showing in a movie theater. The container, or the format of this, is the package of all of this information, all of this data, your video and your audio. And so this would be the .mp4 container or the .mov container. Both of them are QuickTime codecs or QuickTime type files, but the end extension and the container is going to be different. So I know this may still be a little confusing. Just remember that codec refers to the software that's actually compressing your video, that's creating the video, and then the container is the file extension, the housing, the packaging of that information itself. What does compositing mean for video editors? This is simply adding layer upon layer of media to build out your video. So perhaps you have a video and then you add a title card and then you add a little photo or a graphic. It's simply adding layers of video together. That's what compositing is. What is video compression and also bit rate and bit depth? Compression is simply the quality of your video file. So if you want to compress your video file, you can make it smaller, but you're going to lose quality. So if you compress it too much, things are going to start to get pixelated. You can also go too high in your compression, and depending on what your resolution is, there are maximum compressions that it won't matter if you go higher. So this is often represented by bit rate or Mbps, megabits per second. And this is going to be, depending on your editor, a slider where you can actually increase or decrease the Mbps when you are exporting. And depending if you're exporting at standard 1080 HD or 4K or 8K, there is going to be a typical good bit rate that you should export at. So HD 1080 might be around 10 to 12 Mbps, versus if you're doing 4K or something bigger, you might be up at 40 to 50 Mbps. And as you can imagine, that's going to increase the file size because there's more information, more data. So what's the difference between bit rate and bit depth? Think of bit rate as how much information is stored per second, and bit rate is the quality of that information. Now, the quality of that information is going to depend on the camera you are shooting at. Some cameras shoot at a higher bit depth. So you might hear the term 10-bit or 12-bit, 16-bit. And the difference is that within each frame, within each pixel of that recording, you're actually getting more information, more colors. So the higher the bit depth or the higher bit, 16-bit versus 10-bit, you're going to have more information to work with, which helps when you are color grading and color correcting your footage, helps if you're changing the exposure of your footage after the fact, helps if you are working with visual effects. And so the quality of your bits, your information is very important too. But not all cameras can shoot at that higher bit depth or that higher quality. Now, to tie it back to compression, your camera is going to be recording at different compressions. You can usually change the settings to record at a less compressed or a more compressed version. And at a lower compressed video, you're going to have a higher quality video and more information to work with. So there's a lot going on here, but compression is going to decrease or increase the file size and the quality of your video. Bit rate is how much data you are saving per second of video, and bit depth is the quality of that data. Hopefully this helps. What is computer RAM and how does it relate to editing? RAM is basically the space in your computer where it's your short-term memory, where it can save and help process things. So you need RAM to be able to edit on your computer. Adobe recommends a minimum of 8 gigabytes of RAM or memory to edit, but that's going to be very low, especially if you are shooting with 4K or higher resolution cameras, or if you are adding any types of visual effects, graphics to your videos. 16 gigabytes is recommended for the bare minimum for editing HD footage, and then 32 is recommended for working with 4K. But I can tell you from my experience with 128 gigabytes of RAM on my iMac, that even when I'm editing in 4K footage, which I can do pretty seamlessly on my machine, but when I start to add a lot of graphics and effects and things like that, it can still slow down. And in terms of being able to speed up your computer and work with higher resolution video, there's a lot more than just memory that goes into it. You have your graphics card, you have your processor, you have your hard drive space, you have whether you're working on a external hard drive or your internal hard drive, and lots more that goes into running a smooth Adobe Premiere Pro application. But in terms of RAM memory, 16 gigabytes is definitely the minimum recommendation for running Premiere Pro in my books, but I would try to go higher than that. What are deliverables? Deliverables are all of the files that you are asked to deliver to your client when you are done editing your project. So your deliverable might just be an H.264 QuickTime export of the file at 1920 by 1080 HD that your client can take and put online. Or it might be multiple versions of it. They might ask for a 4K version, a 1080p version, or they might ask for the exported version plus all of the original files packaged up on a hard drive. These are all considered deliverables. It's basically just what are you sending to your client at the end of the day when you are done with a project. What is frame rate? Frame rate, also FPS or frames per second, is how many frames is your camera capturing per second. Now, nowadays with digital cameras, this is all happening digitally. But in the old days when you were shooting on actual film, this was literally how many individual pictures was your camera taking or exposing every second. Now back in the day with cinema cameras, they realized that 24 frames per second was a nice number of frames that made the motion of what they were capturing look natural, look similar to how we see it with our human eyes. If you slow down that and you start capturing fewer frames per second, below like 15 or so, you start to get jittery motion when you play that back. Nowadays, our cameras have the option of generally shooting somewhere around 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, and even at higher frame rates. Why would you shoot at a higher frame rate? Shooting at a higher frame rate means that you have smoother motion because you are actually cramming more frames and more information per every second of video. Why is this good? Well, if you're shooting something like sports or action, you might want higher frame rates, something like 60 frames per second, so that the motion of things is even clearer. Otherwise, even at 24 frames per second, if you're shaking your hand in front of the camera or in front of your face, you see a lot of motion blur. But with a higher frame rate, you don't see as much motion blur. And that could be a creative decision that you don't want to see motion blur. Also, shooting at a higher frame rate allows us to slow down our footage after the fact so that we can see slow motion but still have it be clear because you're spreading out more frames per second into a longer time period. If we were trying to slow down a 24 frames per second shot and slow it down, it's going to start to look jittery. So that's why you might shoot at a higher frame rate as well. Now I'm coming from the United States where 24 frames per second is standard, but in many parts of the world, 25 frames per second is that standard sort of cinema style frames per second. 30 frames per second is also another standard that a lot of people shoot nowadays if you are shooting for television or for any online videos. Now you might be saying, hey Phil, I'm trying to get to 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second on my camera, but I don't have that option. I'm seeing something like 2398 or 2997. In essence, it's the same thing. I could go into a lot more detail, but basically 29.97 frames per second is a holdout from when broadcast television changed from black and white to color, and there's lots of technical issues with that frame rate at the time, and still today cameras are shooting at that 29.97 frames per second. So over a period of time, you actually are losing one frame compared to if you were shooting at the full 30 frames per second. But in terms of how we see the video, it doesn't make any difference. So just know that when someone's asking you to shoot 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second or 60, and on your camera you see 2398 or 2997 or 5994, that's basically the same thing. That's what they're asking for. So hopefully now you understand a little bit more about frame rates. What is ingesting? Ingesting is the same as importing. It's basically getting all of your media off of your camera, off of hard drives, off of wherever you're downloading it from, and importing it into your video editing application. So bringing it in to Premiere Pro where you can start to actually work and edit with it. Ingest, import, same thing. What are keyframes? Keyframes are the ability to tell Premiere Pro or any editing application that at a specific point in time, you want to lock down a specific property. So for example, we can say that at 1 second, we want the opacity of our video to be 100%. And then at 2 seconds, we want our opacity to be 0%. Between these 2 points, between these 2 keyframes, there's an animation that takes place, a change in this property that takes the opacity or the transparency of our video clip from 100 to 0, which would fade it out. And so the keyframe is literally just that point in time, that point in the property where you are telling Premiere Pro or After Effects where you want that property to be. And this can be applied to most properties: position, size, audio level. If you're looking at your effect controls panel, when you're applying effects, it can be applied to pretty much anything. That's what a keyframe is. What does lossy versus lossless compression mean? Lossless compression means that you aren't losing any quality when you are exporting, saving your video. It should be the same quality as what you're working with when you save it. Lossy compression means that you are losing data. It is actually compressing more so that the file size, the file quality ends up being smaller and less than the original footage. Lossless, lossy. What is a lower third? This is typically the graphic that appears in the lower third of a video that has the name and perhaps the title of your interviewee or whoever is on the camera. It's just that graphic that typically appears in that lower third region. Nowadays, though, you often see people getting creative, putting the titles in the top third, all over your frame, but still it's often referred to as the lower third. It's just the name and description of whoever's speaking on camera. What is a mask? When you are talking about a mask in video editing, it means creating a cutout of a media asset. So this could be a video clip on your timeline, it could be a photo, it could be a graphic, but there's ways to actually create a cutout. It could also be a circle mask. It could be a square mask. You might also hear this referred to as a matte or a track matte. They're very similar, but it's basically just creating a cutout around something on your timeline. So like a video, for example. But it's basically just creating some sort of cutout around something on your timeline, like a video, for example. What is nesting in Premiere Pro? Well, if you've seen the movie Inception, you should understand this pretty well. It's a sequence inside of a sequence. So it's the ability to actually combine clips that are on a timeline into its own sequence, so that on that master sequence, you are just seeing a single clip, a single asset on that timeline, which organizes and keeps your timeline clean. For example, if you're editing an entire documentary that's 60 minutes, you might have individual scenes on your master timeline that are their own sequence files. Now, I have a lesson in the Premiere Pro course about how to do this, so it might be beneficial to actually see this in practice. But basically, you'll have on your timeline another sequence that you can actually go into and edit. It's a sequence within a sequence. There's other reasons you might nest to be able to apply an effect or something to an entire series of clips rather than doing it individually. That's why you might nest a clip as well. So that's what a nest is. What does opacity mean? Opacity, you can think of it as the transparency of a media asset, of your video, of a graphic. The more opaque means that you can actually see it. The less opaque, or the lower the opacity, means more transparent. In Premiere Pro, we typically have a setting that goes from 0 to 100. Everything's going to start out at a standard of 100 opacity, meaning you can see it. And then if you decrease that, it's going to make that clip more transparent until you get to 0, where you can't see it at all. PAL versus NTSC. These are formats that had to do with analog televisions, which most people don't have or use anymore. NTSC was the standard in North America. PAL was and is standard in Europe and some of Asia. There's maps that you can see online where you can see which one is standard. In terms of editing video and recording video for the modern video creator, it doesn't really matter much. You might buy a camera that is a European camera that is set to PAL, which might change the typical frame rate settings that you use, such as 25 frames per second, compared to in the United States where we shoot at 24 frames per second instead. But in terms of broadcasting our videos to the world, we are doing it now mostly digitally through websites like YouTube or even through television, streaming channels or streaming apps. None of this really matters anymore. Anyone's going to be able to view your video no matter how you shoot it, edit it, unless you were recording and editing video for people who were watching it on an old analog TV in a specific part of the world. So really, NTSC versus PAL doesn't matter anymore. But hopefully now you understand where those terms come from. What is post-production? This might seem kind of standard or obvious, but post-production is everything you do when making a video after the production. So what does that mean? You're not supposed to use the definition, the word in the definition, right, Phil? Well, let's explain the whole process. Pre-production is everything you do before you're actually filming your video or videoing your video. So that's organizing, writing your scripts, getting your talent, building your sets, doing everything you need, scouting your locations, everything you do before you actually start the production, which is the actual recording of your video. Production also includes setting up lights and everything you do on set when you're actually producing your video, actually making your video. Once you're done filming, once you you're done recording any new video. It's now post-production where you are editing your video, you're adding visual effects, you are dubbing it with audio, adding captions. All of that is post-production. And as an Adobe Premiere Pro user, you are working in the post-production phase of your videos. Premiere Pro versus After Effects. This is a question I get all of the time. Which application should I use? Which should I learn? To put it simply, Premiere Pro is where you edit your video. It's where you add your videos in the order that they should be, where you add your B-roll to make it look better. And there's a lot of other things you can do in Premiere Pro too, like adding graphics and titles where you might not even need After Effects. After Effects is where you are adding more advanced visual effects. Maybe you are creating motion graphics and animations that end up in your video, but it's not really where you are actually laying down a sequence of videos. While you can do that in After Effects, it's much more efficient to do that in Premiere Pro. So I recommend using and learning Premiere Pro to edit your videos first. And then if you want to improve your graphics and your visual effects and create things from scratch, then learn After Effects for that. What are proxy files and what is proxy editing? This is when you are actually editing a compressed, smaller file size version of your videos so that your computer can handle it. You would do this when you are working with higher resolution files such as 4K or 8K video, but your computer just cannot handle that process. Your video playback might be a little choppy. So what you do is you create proxies. Proxies are temporary substitutes that are going to be a smaller file size that your computer can handle. So you can go through, you can edit your entire sequence, you can even apply basic color correction and titles and graphics and everything to those files. But at the end of the day, you're going to replace those proxy files with the full resolution footage so that at the end of the day, what you are exporting and sharing with the world is the full high resolution, high quality video. Now, I did mention you can do color correction and color grading with proxy files, but you're going to have a lot more room to work with the original files. So that might be one aspect of your editing workflow where you're going to be not using proxy files. So basic color correction you might be able to get away with, but for more professional, you're going to want to work with your full quality film. But the rest of it, the rest of the process, you can basically use your proxy files. And we have a lesson in the Premiere Pro course on how to do this. What is raw footage? This is just a term that refers to the video files that come direct from the camera. They are unedited, uncolor corrected. The files themselves, the audio quality, everything is uncompressed. It's just the full quality file that comes from your camera or from your audio recording device. It's just that natural footage that's being recorded. What does render mean? To render your timeline, to render a file. In Premiere Pro, what this means is just having Premiere Pro process that file so that it can preview it to you with full quality without any choppy playback. So if you have a file that you've added a lot of special effects to, maybe you've layered on a bunch of clips with graphics and things like that, to render your sequence, to render that timeline means for Premiere Pro to get it ready to process it so that it can preview it to you. You might also hear someone refer to rendering as exporting or saving your video. If you're using Adobe After Effects, to render your footage or your timeline does actually mean to save that footage as a file, a QuickTime file or whatever format you're working with. But in Premiere Pro, render does not mean export. It means preparing your timeline to preview to be able to watch back. Rough cut versus fine cut versus final cut. These terms, it really depends on how you want to use them as a video editor. But typically, a rough cut is just that first draft of a video. It might not contain any graphics or titles or color correction or music or anything. Maybe it's just the sequence of a scene added together. Maybe to you, a rough cut does include some basic graphics and music and everything. Maybe it's your first pass at it. Compared to the final cut though, it's just a version of your edit. I like to use the terms rough, fine, and final. A rough cut to me means I've put everything together, I've edited my video, I've added my graphics, my music, I've done my first pass at it. I've edited it myself. And then I'll go and send that video to my client, or even if it's just a video for myself, I'll watch it myself, and then I'll make another pass at it. I'll go through it again, I'll make changes, I'll perfect and fine-tune the audio, I'll add perhaps more effects or things, I'll respond and do all of the client's notes, and that will be a fine cut. A fine cut, closer to that final cut. And then we'll do one more round of notes, I'll do one more pass at it, and hopefully it will be the final cut. The cut that you are going to actually export. And if you've been editing for a while, if you've been editing for clients for a while though, you know that sometimes there's 5 versions, there's 5 rough cuts or 5 fine cuts until you get to that final cut. But really that rough cut is just that first pass at it, your first attempt at editing that video. What does scrub mean for a video editor? Scrub means it's literally just when you are going through with your mouse or the playhead on your timeline and you are scanning through with your mouse. You are not clicking and playing, you're not even fast forwarding or rewinding, you are just scrubbing through, you are just clicking and dragging through the timeline so you can quickly get to the spot that you want to get to. What is a sequence? A sequence in Premiere Pro is an individual video timeline that you are working on. Now, the way you use a sequence can be different depending on your preference. To me, I can use sequences as different scenes of a long video. Or I can use different sequences as a different version of a project. For example, I might have a full-length version of a video that I put on YouTube and then another version that I cut down to less than 60 seconds for social media. So there's going to be 2 versions, 2 sequences. Other times, and most commonly, I'll use sequences for different drafts of my video. For example, my rough cut, my fine cut, or my final cut, or just version 1, version 2, version 3. I'll save a sequence and duplicate it and edit that next version so that I always have my previous versions to go back to if I want to go back to it or grab something from that sequence and reuse it for a new version or a new sequence. So really a sequence is just an individual timeline that's within a project in Premiere Pro. The way you use them, it's really up to you. What is timecode? Timecode is what you might see on your timeline in Adobe Premiere Pro, but it's also an aspect of recording your video. When you're editing in Premiere Pro, you can see the timecode. It's the hour, minute, second, and frame at the top of your timeline. You can even add this to your videos when you are exporting them. For example, you might burn in the timecode when you are sending a draft of a project to your client. So that way they can tell you at this specific time, even this specific frame, they might have a note for you. The other practical use of timecode is when you're on set and you are filming and recording with multiple devices. Perhaps you're filming a sporting event with multiple cameras, or you're on set and you have a camera and an audio recording device. you can actually use a device to sync the time code of all of those recording devices. So many devices. And so when you get into post-production, it's easy to sync up the video from multiple cameras, the audio from different devices, and everything together, because the time code will be the same on every recording. And if you just match that up, it's going to be perfectly synced. Another time code might come up as an editor is if you are recording or watching through a very long clip. Maybe it's an event, maybe it's an interview. You might refer to specific parts of the time code from 46 minutes and 3 seconds to 47 minutes and 15 seconds when you are working with someone else. You might refer to that moment as, oh, that's a great line. We should really include that in the edit. And so that might be another time you refer to time code. So hopefully that helps you understand what time code is and how you work with it and use it as a video editor. What is a workspace in Premiere Pro? These are different layouts of the panels within Premiere Pro depending on what part of video editing you're doing. Whether you are editing the video versus color grading versus editing audio, Premiere Pro has default workspaces that open up different panels, that make different panels bigger or smaller to help your editing process. You can also create custom workspaces, which might just be a preferred number of panels and a different layout for you, or if you work with multiple monitors, you can create custom workspaces where you have your preview monitor on one screen, your timeline on another. It's all customizable to what you like. But the workspace in Premiere Pro is basically just the layout of the panels and windows in the application itself.